After playing through all the Borderlands games again, I've come to realize something about the third installment that most people may not realize, or want to admit. Borderlands is known for the comedy, the gun variety, the eccentric characters, and the boss fights, but the third game didn't seem up to the task of creating good boss fights. The base game has some of the lamest and reskin abused bosses out of the series, and yes, I am including the pre-sequel. Borderlands 1, let's be honest, doesn't have the most amazing boss fights ever, but they do have variety. From fighting 9 toes to beating the vault monster, each fight gives you something different that you can't get in the regular game or from another boss fight. Let's not forget that the first boss fight doesn't even happen until well into the first part of the game. Beating 9 toes ends the first act and brings you to the next area. The build up to the fight is much more intense than other games that just start you with a fight in the first 5 minutes. We can simply compare the human bosses and find unique differences in them. Crom is a boss fight where he sits in a machine gun turret. Baron Flint has a really powerful sniper rifle. Sledge has a giant hammer. And 9 Toes has 2 skags with him. None of these characters are all that special, but they give you a unique experience and challenge to test your gun-wielding might. I give the original Borderlands credit, not for making the most unique or special fights, but for spacing the bosses out so not to get fatigued. Borderlands 2 is most known for having the best boss fights out of all the Borderlands games, and besides from Bad Maw, I would agree with this. Not only do they have a whole slew of unique characters with unique abilities, but only 2 of the main boss fights are reskins of regular enemies. Knuckle Dragger is just a beefed up Bullymong, and Bad Maw is just a bigger shield bearer. Neither of these fights are that interesting for that reason. Borderlands 2 makes up for these fights with the rest of its list, with Boom Boom, Captain Flint, Bunker, and even the Vault Monster gets high praises. The one thing I always praise Borderlands 2 is for the build-up of these bosses. Even the lowly Knuckle Dragger gets some backstory, with other bosses like Captain Flint, Wilhelm, and of course, Handsome Jack, having story told through transmissions, echoes, and side missions to make the fight that much more interesting. The pre-sequel bosses lack some of the imagination, but make up for it with some good battles, honestly. I don't have much to say about them, but just know that pre-sequel went all out trying to design bosses who aren't just big and powerful versions of a regular enemy. They each have distinct personalities, especially Red Belly, and are all unique to the game. Of course, like I said, these fights do lack a little bit of imagination, with most of them boiling down to take out the guy's shield and then shoot his health bar. But they did try to give each boss their own unique playing field and arsenal. Pre-sequel also continued Borderlands 2's exceptional build-up for boss fights. Besides from the first boss, all the other bosses have some sort of interaction with the player, but less so in the way of side missions and more so with echoes and just regular transmissions.
Get bent, sir. I ain't taking orders from the chick who threw me in prison.
Oh, I'm back here.
Jump pads are stupid.
I will annihilate them!
This brings us, of course, to Borderlands 3. I was really excited for this game, and it even reached number 5 on my top 10 list for 2019. But there were some things holding it back, mainly the story, but also the boss fights. Even back then, I could see how lazy the boss design was in the game. Let's take the first boss, Shiv, for example, who is a badass psycho in every way except for the fact that his mask is red and he's holding a screwdriver. Well, Yemmy, what do you expect from the first boss? I don't expect the world from the first boss in a game, but I do expect them to throw something interesting at you. Shiv at least does get some backstory and an exciting opening with the capture of Claptrap. However, his moveset is identical to a badass psycho, with a slam attack and a spin move.
I'll try spinning, that's a good trick.
Let's see what...
But let's move on to Gigamind, who is barely reskinned, but he is a badass Nog type enemy. I was going to give this fight some credit for some unique moves, but after fighting plenty of badass Nogs during the game, his moveset is widely unchanged, with drone attacks and laser beams. Both Captain Trant and General Trant are the exact same fight. My main issue with this is that both Trants are just every version of the heavy trooper in the Malawan army, having fire, electric, corrosive, and ice attacks all at once. The worst part is that the second time you meet him, he is significantly easier and feels just like a stepping stone more than 3/4 of the way through the game, almost like they felt like they needed a boss fight but couldn't think of anything to do. Even Mouthpiece and Kilowatt have similarities that are too obvious to ignore, both wielding large seals and having an area that they utilize during the fight. Mouthpiece definitely uses more moves that an Enforcer would use, making what could have been a great boss fight just okay. Mouthpiece and Kilowatt both have a nice build-up to the fight. It's just too bad that Mouthpiece lacks more unique moves than just a area of effect sound wave.
Reloading! You're going down, heretic! Ugh.
Although, maybe that's a bit of a stretch. But, you know what isn't? Warden. He's just a reskinned Goliath who even transforms with each time you take his health bar low. He acts and even has the same voice actor as a regular Goliath from the COV. Besides from the first phase of the battle where he gets giant rocket launchers on his back, the rest of the fight is just the same as fighting any other Goliath you'll meet in the game. Finally, we move on to Billy the Anointed, who not only is a pain in the butt, but, once again, is just a regular enemy with a big health bar. You fight plenty of Anointed in various forms, and you'll even see Billy's own archetype again multiple times. And yes, he is a boss fight since he does get an introduction card. Same moves, same skin, and even the same amount of disappointment. Billy's arena isn't even that special. The only special thing about the fight is that they introduce a new enemy type. These reskin boss fights take up a good chunk of Borderlands 3 boss list, and that's very disappointing. 8 boss fights that do nothing but leave a bad taste in your mouth because you either have seen the boss before or will end up fighting a regular version of it over and over again. Of course, there are some great boss fights in Borderlands 3, including the Agonizer, Aurelia, both of the Vault monsters, and Troy. But these good fights are overshadowed by the fact that the developers gave up trying on a good chunk of the other ones. The final boss fight of the game is just one big bullet sponge with a gimmick of climbing onto its back and shooting a weak point. It's just a shame because the final fights of all the other games are actually quite good. When I boot up a Borderlands game, there are a few things I'm looking for. A good laugh, gun variety that keeps me switching things up, trying new builds that change up my playstyle, and feeling accomplishment when taking down a boss. When it comes to Borderlands 3, it has some laughs, great gun variety, and plenty of options for your build. But half the bosses in this game, I feel like I'm just fighting a regular enemy that will spit out tons of loot. It's so disappointing that the amount of reskinned boss fights almost equal the unique boss fights. The proof is in the writing too. bosses like Gigamind, Billy, and the Warden get the minimum for backstory and extras. I wouldn't mind if these reskins were side mission bosses, and there are a few beefed up enemies who are a part of side missions, but when they seep so heavily into your main lineup, it puts a lot of pressure on the unique fights to make an impact. Unfortunately, that just didn't happen. Who's that in the distance?
Okay, so Borderlands. I think the main crux of most Borderlands games is a story plot from A to B. It sounds simple, but that it is. On the way are eccentric and elaborate characters that play a good role within the game, and defeating them allows the game to reward you, the player, as a result, with cool, one-of-a-kind, character-specific items or weapons. Their role is brief, and their background relates specifically to the main plots, rather than being a small side aspect. So as a result, especially for me as a player, I look forward to their moment in the game. It's almost like a checkpoint. I look forward to fighting Sledge. I look forward to fighting Crom. It doesn't feel like you're being prevented from moving forward by being berated by time-wasting bosses. So in previous games, the amount of playtime doesn't feel relevant as the bosses lead you forward in the tale, rather than almost being a stopgap for a bit of extra gameplay. So this, for me, makes Borderlands 3 feel like it's dragging and taking so much longer to complete, despite the average playtime being the exact same as Borderlands 1, at approximately 22.5 hours. I did my research. So why is it then that Borderlands 1 feels like the shortest game out of the three? The game allows you to fall in love with the characters, understand that the good guys are the good guys and the bad guys are the bad guys, therefore enabling you to focus on the things that Borderlands is famous for: the comedy, the guns, and the fights. So why is it that this simple phrase explains it so much? It seems like Borderlands 3 has taken a different route. You know, let's be fair, let's be honest, the games have never been shy to controversy in eliminating fan favourite or well-known characters, but in this one, for some reason, it just feels different. It feels out of place almost. The main intense issues that players are faced with just seem to overpower the storyline rather than allowing it to flow with it, forcing the player to identify the weak points in the game, which most notably are the stopgap bosses and the almost irritating cameos from past characters that are just, shall we be nice, not loved in the same way. If we take a look, all loved characters from past games suffer huge losses or even more. So, spoilers here. So if we look back, we can see Mordecai is lost with Bloodwing, Roland dies, Maya dies, and to an extent as well, Lilith not only loses her powers and gets them back again, but then dies at the end of the game. Let's look at who doesn't suffer any loss or die. Brick. 0. And let's be honest, whoever else that anyone could think of that we don't really give a shit about. And that, for me as a player, kills my interest in the game. You lose interest in the lore, the events, you almost forget about the outcome to an extent, because it doesn't matter who the bosses are. They're not good enough, or they're not varied enough to balance out the loss. The characters that are painfully shoehorned into being a main character just don't feel like they fit. Something almost doesn't work, it doesn't fit, it's the wrong jigsaw piece. It becomes insulting to an extent that you need to battle a redressed bad guy. So, unlike Borderlands 1 or Borderlands 2, 3 doesn't provide that level of winning, almost, the happily ever after to completing the game, even though you've suffered a loss with a character. The bosses aren't demanding, there's no fear of losing because you've lost that investment. And honestly, the hardest boss of all of Borderlands 3, let's just put it this way, it's not the one that's meant to be the most savage and powerful one of them all, that's for sure.